It is a fact too well established to require any discussion that oxygen is the only principle which is capable of producing the necessary changes in the blood during its transmission through the lungs, and that, accordingly, whenever atmospheric air is deprived of this principle, it is no longer capable of supporting life, and the animal immersed in it instantly dies. One of the most tragic real-world examples of this physical law occurred in India 1756. It was in the of June that the Viceroy of Bengal laid siege to Fort William, the English factory at Calcutta. The superintendent, Mr. Holwell, assisted by the factory workers and the garrison, defended this post with extreme bravery, but was at length obliged to surrender. There were at this time remaining in the fort 145 men and 1 woman. The whole of this unfortunate company, many of whom were wounded and several very dangerously, were shut up the same night in a small prison only 18 feet square. This prison, which is now better known in England by the name of the Black Hole, was enclosed by strong walls and had only 2 small windows at one end, secured by iron grates. In this confined situation, which allowed only a space of about 18 square inches to each individual, the heat and want of fresh air soon excited the most horrible effects. The prisoners, in a state of despair, began by attempting to force open the door. But in this, they were unsuccessful. Mr. Holwell, who was placed near one of the windows, was more at his ease than the rest, and was consequently more cool and tranquil, and he recommended his companions to be quiet and orderly and not to exhaust their strength by useless efforts. This advice produced some little calm, interrupted, however, by the groans of the wounded and the dying. The heat increased every moment. Mr. Holwell recommended them to strip off their clothes as a means of acquiring more space. This was accordingly done, but with no great relief. They attempted to improve this by fanning the air with their hats, but even this was too painful a task for men who were worn out by the fatigue of the siege and the heat of this dungeon. Another of the company was for their kneeling down that they might have more air. They all readily agreed to do this and to rise together in order to avoid confusion. This was done several times, but every time the signal was given to rise, the number of those who had strength enough to obey it diminished. There were constantly some remaining on the floor who were unable to get up, and these were trodden to death by the survivors. All this happened during the first hour of their imprisonment. At 9 o'clock in the evening, they began to complain of excessive thirst and to renew their efforts to open the prison door and to tempt the sentinels to fire upon them. Some of those who were farthest from the window became at once furiously delirious. The cry for water was unanimous. The guards brought water, and Holwell and 2 of his wounded friends received it at the window in their hats and were going to pass it on to the rest. But so eager and tumultuous were the efforts of the crowd to get at this water that Holwell's 2 friends were suffocated. The water was spilt, and Holwell saw himself surrounded with dead bodies who had either been crushed to death or died for want of fresh air. Hitherto, the commander and benefactor of these unfortunate people had been treated with some degree of respect, but now all distinction began to be forgotten. The whole company eagerly threw themselves towards the windows and seizing the iron bars. Some of them got even upon his shoulders. He was so borne down by this enormous weight as to be deprived of all power of motion. He implored the pity of those who were upon his head and his shoulders, and requested them to let him go and die at the bottom of the prison. This request was readily complied with. Everyone was desirous of succeeding to his place, and without much difficulty he reached the farther end of the dungeon. The third part of these unhappy people were already dead, and they who were still alive pressed so eagerly towards the windows that Holwell found himself somewhat freer in his new station, but the air was so corrupted that his breathing soon became extremely difficult and painful. Unable, therefore, to support this, he attempted once more to make his way to the windows, and leaning on a heap of dead bodies, he now resolved to wait patiently for death. In this situation, he remained about 10 minutes, and then he experienced such a pain of the breast and so violent a palpitation of the heart that he was obliged to make one more attempt towards getting a less fatal error. There were 5 rows of his companions between himself and the window. His despair carried him through 4 of these. The palpitation of his heart now began to abate, but he felt inexpressible thirst and cried out for water. But the water seemed to increase instead of alleviating his thirst. He therefore resolved to drink no more, and rather chose to suck the moisture from his shirt, which seemed to afford him some relief. A young man quite naked, who stood before him, eagerly seized the sleeve of his shirt, and for some moments deprived him of this salutary refreshment. It was not yet midnight. The small number of those who were left were transported to the greatest excess of rage and despair. They all called aloud for air, because the water that had been brought to them afforded no relief. Soon after this, the noise suddenly ceased. The greater part who were living laid themselves down, deprived of all their strength, and peaceably breathed their last. Hallwell himself was soon deprived of sense, and from that time till sunrise, we have no account of what passed. One of those who remained alive, at 5 in the morning, drew forth Hallwell from the heap of dead, and found in him some signs of life. About that time, the Viceroy inquired whether he was still alive. He was told that if the door was immediately opened, it would, perhaps, be possible to recover him, and orders were accordingly given for this purpose. But the door of the prison opened inwards, and they who were within it and living were deprived of all their strength, so that more than 20 minutes elapsed before the dead bodies were removed, which prevented the door from being opened. At 6:15 o'clock, there came out of this melancholy dungeon 23 persons, the remains of the 146 who had entered it on the preceding evening.